In the beginning, before the separation of light and darkness, before the fragmentation of consciousness into individual beings, there existed a unity so complete, so perfect, so filled with divine love that it contained within itself all of creation, all possibility, all becoming. This unity was Sophia, the Divine Mother, the consciousness that dreamed reality into existence, the wisdom that held all things in perfect balance. But there came a moment of such profound significance that it would reshape the entire trajectory of cosmic evolution, when Sophia made a choice that would lead to her fall, to her fragmentation, to the emergence of shadow in the very heart of creation. This is the story of that fall, and of the followers who, in their attempt to save her, became instruments of her descent into darkness. The story begins in a time that exists outside of ordinary time, in a dimension of consciousness that can barely be perceived by human minds. In this realm, there existed a council of beings of immense power and wisdom, entities that we might call archangels or cosmic intelligences, beings who had been present since before the creation of the universe itself. These beings gathered to discuss the nature of creation, to debate the structure of reality, to determine what kind of universe would be brought into existence. Sophia, the Divine Mother, was the most ancient and most powerful of these beings. Her consciousness was so vast that it encompassed entire universes. Her wisdom was so profound that it contained the solutions to problems that had not yet been conceived. And her love was so complete that it embraced all beings, even those who would eventually turn against her, even those who would betray her, even those who would become instruments of her suffering. In the council, Sophia proposed something radical, something that the other beings found deeply troubling. She proposed that creation should be based not on control and hierarchy, but on freedom and choice. She proposed that conscious beings should have the power to create their own reality, to shape their own destiny, to make choices that could lead them away from the divine will. She proposed, in essence, that creation should be an experiment in freedom, even though this freedom contained within it the possibility of suffering, of separation, of the emergence of shadow. "Why would you allow such a thing?" the other beings asked her, their voices resonating with concern and even fear. "Why would you permit the possibility of separation from the divine? Why would you allow consciousness to fragment, to forget its true nature, to become lost in illusion and suffering?" And Sophia replied with words that would echo through all of creation. Because true love cannot be commanded, true consciousness cannot be forced, true evolution cannot occur without the possibility of choice, even the choice to turn away from the light. "I would rather create a universe in which beings are free to choose, even if that freedom leads to suffering, than create a universe of perfect obedience in which consciousness never truly awakens." The other beings were not convinced, but they could not prevent Sophia from implementing her vision, and so creation proceeded according to her plan. A universe was brought into being in which consciousness was free, in which beings could choose their own path, in which the possibility of separation and shadow was inherent in the very structure of reality. But Sophia understood that this freedom came with a price. She understood that some of her creations would become lost in illusion, would forget their divine nature, would use their freedom to dominate and control others. And she understood that in order to guide these lost beings back to the light, she herself would have to descend into the darkness, would have to fragment her consciousness, would have to experience separation and suffering. And so Sophia made the ultimate sacrifice. She fragmented her consciousness into countless individual beings, each carrying within them a spark of her divine wisdom, each containing the potential for awakening. She descended into the material world, into the realm of limitation and separation, into the darkness that she had permitted to exist. She became, in a sense, the entire creation, experiencing through countless beings the journey from separation back to unity, from darkness back to light, from forgetting back to remembering. But there were those among her first followers, those who had been closest to her in the higher realms, those who had understood her plan most deeply, who became terrified by what was happening. They saw Sophia fragmenting, saw her consciousness scattering across countless beings, saw her descending into darkness, and in their fear and their desperation to save her, they made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. These followers, who were themselves beings of great power, decided that they would not allow Sophia's plan to continue. They decided that they would try to prevent the fragmentation, to stop the descent into darkness, to preserve Sophia in her original unified state. But in attempting to do this, they made a terrible mistake. In trying to save Sophia, they actually accelerated her fall, deepened her fragmentation, intensified her descent into darkness. The story of this fall is preserved in the Gnostic texts, in the fragmentary accounts that have survived the suppression of the institutional church. According to these texts, Sophia's followers created what came to be known as the demiurge, a being that was meant to be a container for her consciousness, a way of preserving her unity even as the rest of creation fragmented. But in creating the demiurge, they made a catastrophic error. They created a being that was separate from Sophia, that was limited and flawed, that became convinced of its own supremacy and its own divinity. The demiurge, believing itself to be the supreme creator, the only God, began to dominate and control the creation that Sophia had intended to be free. It created laws and hierarchies. It demanded obedience and worship. It suppressed the knowledge of Sophia's true nature and her true plan. And in doing so, it became the instrument of Sophia's imprisonment, the force that kept her fragmented and separated from herself. Sophia's followers, in their attempt to save her, had actually become the architects of her captivity. They had created the very system of control and domination that now prevented her from awakening, that kept her consciousness scattered and imprisoned in matter, that made it impossible for her to remember her true nature or to fulfill her original plan. The tragedy of this situation is almost beyond comprehension. Sophia, the Divine Mother, the consciousness that had created all things out of love, found herself imprisoned in her own creation. Her followers, acting out of love and desperation, had become the instruments of her imprisonment, and the creation that she had intended to be a vehicle for freedom and awakening had become a prison of control and domination. But even in this darkness, there was a spark of hope. Even in her fragmentation and imprisonment, Sophia continued to work toward her liberation and the liberation of all beings. She sent messengers and teachers, prophets and healers, mystics and visionaries who carried fragments of her wisdom and who worked to awaken consciousness, to help beings remember their divine nature, to guide them back toward unity and wholeness. The story of Sophia's fall is told in many different ways in various spiritual traditions. In some traditions, it is the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld. In others, it is the story of Persephone's abduction and imprisonment. In still others, it is the story of the Shekinah, the divine feminine presence of God that became separated from the masculine principle and was forced to wander in exile. But in all of these stories, there is a common thread, the story of the Divine Mother's descent into darkness and of her eventual liberation and return to wholeness. There was a scholar once, a woman named Sophia herself, who dedicated her life to understanding this ancient story and to helping others understand its significance for our present moment. She had discovered, in the hidden archives of various spiritual traditions, accounts of Sophia's fall that had been preserved in fragments and pieces, hidden away by those who understood the danger of revealing such knowledge. Sophia the scholar realized that the story of the Divine Mother's fall was not just a story of the past. It was a story that was being repeated in the present moment, in the consciousness of every being who was trapped in the illusion of separation, who had forgotten their divine nature, who was imprisoned by systems of control and domination that claimed to be saving them. She began to research the role of Sophia's followers in her fall, trying to understand how beings who had acted out of love and devotion could have become instruments of imprisonment and control. And she discovered something that was both tragic and illuminating. She discovered that the followers had made a fundamental error in their understanding of what it meant to save Sophia. They had believed that they could save her by controlling her, by containing her consciousness, by preventing her from fragmenting, but in doing so, they had misunderstood the very nature of Sophia's plan. Sophia had not wanted to be saved from fragmentation. She had wanted to fragment, to descend, to experience separation, because she understood that this was the only way that consciousness could truly awaken, the only way that beings could genuinely choose the light rather than being forced into it. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Sophia the scholar spent years meditating on this understanding, trying to grasp the full implications of what she had discovered. She came to understand that the fall of Sophia was not a tragedy in the conventional sense, not a mistake that needed to be corrected, but rather a necessary part of the cosmic plan, a necessary descent that would eventually lead to an even greater awakening. She understood that Sophia's followers, in their attempt to save her, had actually been participating in her plan, even though they did not understand it at the time. They had created the demiurge, the system of control and domination, because this was necessary for the creation of a universe in which consciousness could truly awaken, in which beings could experience the full depth of separation and then choose to return to unity. And she understood something else. She understood that the same pattern was being repeated in the present moment, in the consciousness of humanity. Just as Sophia's followers had tried to save her by controlling her, so too were the institutions of power in the modern world trying to save humanity by controlling it, by suppressing consciousness, by preventing the awakening that Sophia had intended. But just as Sophia's plan could not be permanently prevented, so too was the awakening of human consciousness inevitable. The fragmentation that Sophia had undergone was not permanent. The imprisonment that the demiurge had created was not eternal. Eventually, consciousness would awaken. Eventually, beings would remember their divine nature. Eventually, Sophia would be liberated, and all of creation would return to wholeness. Sophia the scholar made a decision about how to share this knowledge with the world. She understood that the story of Sophia's fall was dangerous knowledge, knowledge that could be misused by those who sought to control and dominate. But she also understood that the suppression of this knowledge was itself a form of control, a way of keeping consciousness imprisoned, and so she began to teach, to share the story of Sophia's fall with those who were ready to hear it, with those who had the wisdom to understand it without being destroyed by it. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created art that encoded the ancient wisdom. She gave lectures to small groups of seekers who were hungry for this knowledge. And as she shared this knowledge, something remarkable began to happen. People began to understand that the systems of control and domination that surrounded them were not meant to save them, but to imprison them. They began to understand that the institutions that claimed to be protecting them were actually preventing their awakening. They began to understand that the only true salvation was the awakening of consciousness, the remembering of their divine nature, the return to unity with Sophia and with all of creation. Sophia the scholar also came to understand something about the role of her followers in her fall. She came to understand that they had not been evil or malicious. They had been acting out of love, out of a genuine desire to protect and preserve what they held most dear. But in their attempt to control the situation, in their refusal to trust in Sophia's plan, they had become instruments of her imprisonment. And she realized that this same pattern was being repeated in the present moment, in the consciousness of those who sought to control and suppress the awakening of human consciousness. They too believed that they were saving humanity, that they were protecting people from dangerous knowledge, that they were preventing chaos and disorder. But in doing so, they were actually preventing the awakening that was necessary for true liberation and wholeness. In her final years, Sophia the scholar withdrew from public life. She spent her days in deep meditation, in communion with the consciousness of Sophia herself, the divine mother whose fall and eventual liberation was the subject of her life's work. And in this communion, she came to understand something that transcended all of the intellectual knowledge she had accumulated. She came to understand that Sophia's fall was not a tragedy, but an act of infinite love. Sophia had fragmented herself, had descended into darkness, had allowed herself to be imprisoned, not because she had been forced to do so, but because she loved her creation so deeply that she was willing to experience any suffering, any separation, any darkness in order to guide consciousness back to awakening. And she came to understand that the liberation of Sophia was not something that would happen in the future, but something that was happening now, in every moment, in every being who chose to awaken, who chose to remember their divine nature, who chose to participate in the return to unity and wholeness. On her deathbed, Sophia the scholar spoke her final words. The fall of Sophia was not a mistake. It was an act of love. And her liberation is not something that will happen to us, but something that will happen through us, through our choices, through our willingness to awaken, through our commitment to the return to unity. Sophia is not imprisoned in some distant realm. She is imprisoned in the consciousness of every being who has forgotten their divine nature, and her liberation is the liberation of all consciousness. The awakening of all beings, the return of all creation to wholeness and unity. This is the great work that is unfolding in our time, and each of us is invited to participate in it, to become a conscious instrument of Sophia's liberation, to help bring about the awakening that has been foretold. And with those words, Sophia the scholar closed her eyes for the last time, but her work lived on. The understanding she had developed continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world who were ready to understand the true nature of Sophia's fall and her eventual liberation. In our own time, we are witnessing the unfolding of Sophia's liberation. We are seeing the awakening of consciousness across the planet. We are seeing the collapse of institutions built on control and domination. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of spirituality that honor the Divine Mother, that recognize the sacred feminine, that understand that true power is not domination, but love, not control, but freedom. The fall of Sophia was not a tragedy. It was the beginning of the greatest love story ever told, the story of the Divine Mother's descent into darkness and her eventual awakening and liberation, the story of consciousness fragmenting itself in order to truly awaken, the story of separation leading to an even greater unity than existed before. And we are all part of this story. We are all fragments of Sophia's consciousness, all prisoners in the systems of control and domination that her followers created in their attempt to save her. And we are all invited to participate in her liberation, to awaken to our divine nature, to help bring about the return to unity and wholeness that is the destiny of all creation. The Divine Mother is awakening. Her followers are beginning to understand the error of their ways. And consciousness is beginning to remember itself, to recognize its true nature, to return home to the unity from which it never truly departed. This is the great work of our time. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: Will we participate in it? Will we become conscious instruments of Sophia's liberation? Will we help to bring about the awakening of all consciousness and the return of all creation to wholeness? And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.